Today's scripture from Joshua is a reminder. It's a reminder that this idea of the importance of having a memorial for things that are critical in our lives is something we should be always doing. I love that phrase in there. So when the children ask, you'll be able to tell them what this is. It's a reminder for us. It's a permanent memorial. And on the other side of that, I didn't have this scripture read. It's just got a snippet of it from Luke, the 11th chapter, the 44th verse, where Jesus is speaking, and he says this to the Pharisees, "Woe to you, for you are like unmarked graves, and people walk over you without realizing it." I think we have kind of the balance there, don't we, with the importance of the memorial and what happens if we forget about memorials and the importance not of the memorial itself, but what it represents. And so it's an opportunity for us to do there. And I've thought a lot about that idea of unmarked graves. Isn't that one of the saddest things you could imagine, to have an unmarked grave? I remember a while back reading in the New York Times where they were preparing for a new building and they were excavating, and when they did, they found some graves, and as they studied it, they found out they were the graves of some of the first blacks that were freed in our country that then went to New York City, and they'd just been covered over and forgotten. How sad that is, and it happens in other ways too. And I think sometimes we can miss them or we can forget about them, and they can lay unmarked for all kinds of reasons. Sometimes it's money. I mean, sometimes we financially just can't afford to put the marker up that we want, can we? Sometimes, like in that building, graves get shoved to the side because it's progress. And so we move them, we forget about them, we build buildings around them. I remember somewhere seeing, not long ago, in the last year, a picture of a highway that the people would not move their cemetery, and so each lane of the highway was built around the cemetery. They were not going to allow those graves to go unmarked and unnoticed. And sometimes we do just forget about it. And sometimes then what we do can become simply just a ritual. And that's what Jesus was talking about. Jesus was speaking to the Pharisees about all their rituals. And we know one thing about the Pharisees, they were good at rituals, weren't they? I mean, they were definitely knew what they were doing. I mean, and a lot of them made sense and they were important. I mean, wash your hands before you eat. That makes sense, doesn't it? Honor your guests when they come to visit you. That makes sense also. One of the things the Pharisees did, though, was they kept track of all these rituals and all these rules. And they were very important to them, and the importance became not in what they represented, but in obeying the rules. And sometimes rituals can outlive their usefulness. They don't make any sense anymore, and it's something we just do so we can say we've done it. Do you have any rituals like that in your life? There's something you do just so you can say you've done it? It happens to all of us. I found a story by Columbia Seminary professor Paul Huff. And one of the things he talks about is the particular synagogue where there was a rabbi that the folks just loved. And the rabbi had a cat that would wander around the synagogue, and the cat seemed to be enthralled with the rabbi's voice. So whenever the rabbi would get up to preach, the cat would just start going all over the place. And so some of the folks in the church decided that wasn't a good idea. And so what would happen from then on is when the rabbi would get up to speak, someone would take the cat and tie it to a chair so it couldn't wander around during the message that the rabbi was presenting. And over time, it became their tradition. Eventually, that rabbi passed away and a new rabbi came. And the first Sunday he was there, he got up to preach. And he got up to preach and to speak to the folks of the synagogue. Somebody took the cat and tied it to the chair. And the new rabbi said, "Well, why are you doing that? Why are you tying a cat to the chair?" And the reply was, "We always do that. We always do that before the sermon." And so the rabbi just shrugged and said, "Okay, if that's what we do." And to this day in that synagogue, no matter what rabbi gets up to speak, someone ties a cat to a chair. And the sad thing is, they do it for a reason that no one remembers. And sometimes that's the way rituals become in our life. they outlive their usefulness. They lose their grounding in faith if it's something that we've grounded in faith in our ritual. And we follow them for no good reason, at least no reason anyone remembers. In the story from Luke, Jesus didn't wash his hands before his meal, and the Pharisees were angry and they were mad at him for breaking the ritual. And Jesus said to them, "Why do you think the act of washing hands is so important? You see, it's not the ritual itself that matters. That's just tying the cat to the chair." And Jesus says this, "All your rituals are like unmarked graves with people walking over them without realizing it, without realizing what they stand for." There isn't anything sacred anymore, Jesus was saying. We just do rituals that don't mean anything. There are no stones to remember. If we have the piles of stones, we forgot what they were for. Joshua says, when your children ask, tell them. Tell them the importance of this. Tell them the importance of what's going on. We're not honoring anymore what's truly important. And that brings me to today. This weekend that we call Memorial Day weekend, the stones that we've gathered to celebrate, to remember, to honor on this day, are we telling our children what they stand for? Are we telling our children the importance of this weekend? Do we remember as we gather the importance of this weekend? The first Memorial Day was observed in 1868 to remember the dead of the Civil War, or Jed, the War of Northern Aggression for you. But it was a day that we called to remember something significantly important. And we started, in fact, they honored the dead of both sides. You see, it wasn't just to honor the victors and the cost of war for the victors. It was to remember the cost of war for all involved, even the survivors. There are many of us in this room that have served our country. We remember the cost, the things we experience, the things we carry with us to this day. And so Memorial Day is a day to honor those that have given the ultimate price, but for the rest of us to recognize the importance and the cost of that. The first state to recognize this was New York in 1873. And it's interesting to note that no state in the South recognized Memorial Day until after World War I, when we changed the emphasis from being about the Civil War to being about all wars. And so we began to do that. We began to note that one of the important things about Memorial Day is to recognize it's a time of reconciliation also, to honor all of those who gave the ultimate price for freedom and for their country. I don't know if you realize this, but in the year 2000, to help re-educate us, Congress passed an act called the National Moment of Remembering. And they began to ask, and do any of you remember this? Does anyone in here remember this? That's what I figured. I remember hearing it at the time, but I'd forgotten it. And they're asking each of us on Memorial Day tomorrow at 3 p.m. to take a moment to remember the importance of this day and what it represents, either by a time of silence or by listening to taps. Decorating graves has always been the tradition of this weekend. In fact, it used to be called, when I was young, Decoration Day. You remember that? Decoration Day, honoring the soldiers who had died. It started out being May 30th. And some of you young folks don't remember, but May 30th was Memorial Day. It wasn't the last 3-day weekend in May. It was literally May 30th. In 1971 was when Congress moved to make it a 3-day weekend. And representatives of veterans groups at the time said this: that's when all hell broke loose. The holiday moved from what it was in honoring those that had died in service. It moved to a weekend of grilling, drinking, splashing in the water, playing golf, and watching NASCAR. And I'm not sure that's too far off. The VFW itself said it was one of the worst things that happened to the honoring of those that have given the ultimate cost. Changing the date undermined the very meaning. It became an empty ritual, and we became like unmarked graves, losing the meaning of the day, losing the understanding of the stones that are gathered, forgetting that it's a day to honor those that have given all, those that have given the ultimate cost. So is Memorial Day important to us today? Is it a day we should be honoring and celebrating? As people of faith, do we have a word to speak on this day? I mean, that's always important. There are a lot of holidays that come and go, and as people of faith, they're not important to us. But on this particular one, do we have a word that we can say? And I think we do, and the word comes from Paul. Paul talks about suffering, and that's really what we're honoring, the suffering, the ultimate sacrifice today. And Paul says it this way: we should boast in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance, endurance produces character, and character produces hope. See, honoring those that have given the ultimate cost is a time for us all to remember that we move from suffering to hope. Those that have experienced war understand the suffering, the pain, the sorrow, the cost. But as people of faith, we remember on a day like today so we can move from suffering to hope. And we continually should remember it for that reason. Paul said that hope is so significant and so important. It's a process that we should be honoring at Memorial Day. We should be remembering at Memorial Day. Skipping the process of moving from suffering to hope leaves us with a long weekend that's pleasurable but largely pointless. It's just another 3-day weekend. But it's important for us to recognize the folks who have given all so that we might move from suffering and sacrifice, from struggle and death, to endurance, to character, and to hope. Because above all, we are a people of hope, and our hope is found in Jesus. There's a great story that I came across as I was preparing the message. It's a real story that shows moving from suffering to hope in a short period of time. It's a story about Alan Wood. Alan Wood never claimed to be a hero. He wasn't a hero. But he wanted to honor those who made sacrifices on Iwo Jima. Iwo Jima, as most of us remember, was a little volcanic island in the South Pacific that the American troops fought the Japanese troops over for 5 days at the cost of almost 7,000 lives. I know from being here in this community that we had somebody that died in that battle, and the street Iwo was named after them after that battle. I have an uncle that died on Iwo Jima, and it was a very, very bitter, difficult battle. And many of us, if we know little about Iwo Jima, we remember the raising of the flag, don't we? When finally we got to the top of Mount Suribachi, and the fighting wasn't over, by the way. The bitter fighting was still going on. And we wanted to move from suffering to hope, from loss of life to hope for the future. And so there are few Marines gathered there, and they raised this flag. And not everybody knows this story, but it was a small flag. And not everybody could see that flag. So a Marine went down to the ship where Alan Wood was on the ship, and they said, "We need a big flag. We need a flag so everyone can see to bring hope to the fighting that's going on." It just so happened that Alan Wood had procured at Pearl Harbor a 37-square-foot flag. And he gave them the flag. And they put it on a pipe, and they rushed back up Mount Suribachi. And 5 Marines and 1 Navy corpsman raised that flag. And when they did the second time, photographer Joe Rosenthal took a picture that still lives in our memory today if you're above a certain age. It still is with us today. It won him a Pulitzer Prize. But for us, it became, in the midst of suffering, a symbol of endurance, character, and hope for all of those who had given the ultimate cost in that battle. Alan Wood's son said he didn't talk much about that. He didn't talk much about giving the flag because he didn't want to bring attention to himself. He said they needed a flag and he gave it to them. Wood said this, "I was humbled by the fact that there were so many among us that were able to face a situation where human life was so cheap and yet bring hope. Bring hope." Memorial Day is a time for that. It's a time to remember the sacrifice and the suffering, not as an end to itself, but as suffering as part of this process that produces endurance and character and ultimately hope. Paul has said that we get through tough times because God's love has been poured into our hearts. That's how we survive. This love enables us to overcome pain and injustice that's often a part of life. As we endure it, we develop a moral and ethical character, and as we refine the love in our hearts, it becomes a deep reservoir for the hope of God. Memorial Day is a time that's not set aside to glorify war. It's a time to recognize the high cost of war and to remember the price that many have paid. It is for us to honor those that have given the ultimate sacrifice. Honoring those who gave their life in service to this country does not exalt them above others who have done the same thing. Rather, is an acknowledgement of the freedom that we enjoy and for which we are so deeply grateful, and to recognize what a costly and precious gift it is. Allowing this day, this weekend, to become an empty ritual. Allowing this day and this weekend to become an unmarked grave. Allowing this day and this weekend to become more about grilling and getting away for the weekend than honoring those that have sacrificed is not acceptable. It does a disservice to all of those who have paid the ultimate price. But you know something else it does? It allows us to forget about the unbelievably high cost of war on families, on individuals. We can just forget about it and act like it didn't happen and it's something in the past, something we don't need to remember, and it makes war way too acceptable and way too sterile. And we should only enter into war with great trepidation. And so today, I want to remind you, I want to ask you to begin again this year, to make Memorial Day weekend about a time to honor those who gave their lives, to honor those and to take pause and to remember the pain, the tragedy, the cost of ultimate sacrifice. So here's what I'm going to ask each and every one of us to do. I'm going to ask us to go back to the year 2000. I'm going to go back to ask what Congress asked us to do. If you can't go to the cemetery, if you can't do any of that, I would encourage you to do that if you can. But if you can't, tomorrow at 3 p.m., may you honor this day and those that have given all. And maybe you can honor it in any way you'd like. But I would suggest at 3 p.m. tomorrow, a time of silence. Or if you can, listen to the sound of taps being played.